Hello and welcome. Today's topic is communication assessments for individuals with complex communication needs. The Angelman Syndrome Foundation Communication Training Series is made available by the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and a generous grant from the Foster Family Charitable Foundation, a family foundation established in Central California. Today's topic on communication assessment is part of the testing section of the 5-step structure that we've been using in this series. Let's just take a look at a couple of webinar outcomes. It's my hope that at the end of this webinar you will have a better understanding of the features of a good assessment. You will know some of the recommended assessment tools appropriate for individuals with complex communication needs, and I hope that you'll have an improved ability to use observation to inform your assessment, as that's going to be part of our training today. Let's go back to the 5 steps and use that as a framework to talk about communication assessments. We'll start up at the top with targets, or the purposes, intended outcomes, etc. of communication assessments. We'll then go to the second section and talk about how to conduct assessments and including the features of good communication assessment. In the tools section, we'll identify specific assessments and other resources and their features. The fourth section will cover the content and format of the results of our assessments. And then in the last section, we'll talk about next steps related to the information in this webinar. So let's get into our targets, or purposes and intended outcomes of the communication assessment. So that's going to drive everything that comes after that, is why are we doing this? If we look at the IDEA Part C definition, we see that it states that assessment is the ongoing procedures used by qualified personnel to identify the child's unique strengths and needs, and early intervention services appropriate to meet those needs throughout the period of the child's eligibility. Now this is from Part C, so it's for the early intervention group, but the definition applies as well to our school-age students. And here I have just sort of a gloss that'll help to break down that definition a little bit more, to be ongoing procedures identifying unique strengths and needs, and identifying services to meet those needs. So that's sort of the intended purpose of assessment. If we take a look and combine that definition with other requirements related to the IEP, and then we apply it specifically to communication, we get a picture of a communication assessment that includes identification of strengths and needs, specifically communication skills and abilities and communication challenges, and then also looking at what successful strategies or methods or approaches are there for that student, or what contexts or environments might enhance their performance. We also would use assessment to identify services, and of course services are connected to our goals and our instructional plans. So assessments should inform all of these pieces of our program. When I think of assessment, I honestly think in a very shortened form: what information do I need to inform and improve my instructional program? So what do I need to know about what I'm doing that's going to make instruction better and hopefully outcomes better? Okay, so now let's just move right along to teaching and tasks, which in this case would be, what are the features of a good or a strong communication assessment? And we're going to just start by looking at some of the weaknesses of some assessment protocols and how they're administered. This particular list was taken from Charity Rowland, a presentation that she did, and she is one of the developers of the communication matrix, and she looked at some of the weaknesses that she recognized in many assessments and noted that they often accommodated only speech in terms of a response, that they don't address the earliest stages of communication in sufficient detail to show progress, so they're too gross. That they may not probe for meaningful behaviors and instead look for more of a production of a behavior. They don't necessarily accommodate sensory or physical impairments, and they can emphasize what the child cannot do. I created a very similar list before I found that previous one, so I just sort of piggybacked on that and highlighted a couple of the ones that I really think are the strongest, have the strongest impact on the assessments and the quality of assessments that I see. So the first one being lack of sufficient detail. So the measurement tools are just not matching where the student's abilities are, and so we're missing a lot of information when we apply those tools, and also that then lends itself to focusing on what the student can't do because you're not getting a good picture. The other piece that I recognize in a lot of assessments is that the student may be demonstrating certain communicative functions or displaying certain skills, but they're in a form that is not necessarily recognized by the assessor. And so that's one of the things we're going to do on the latter end of this webinar, is to look at some video clips so that we can start to translate some of the actions of our students into actual communicative functions and assign them meaning, so that they may be more visible on our assessments. Okay, so let's flip that list around from the weaknesses and focus on what makes an assessment a strong assessment. And let's look first at what content we would like to see. So good assessments, you would use more than one tool. So not just relying on one specific measure, but using a bunch of different measures. And I think when you see the reference list of tools that accompany this webinar, you'll see that there are lots of options available for that. Those tools would look at both the forms and functions of communication. So the functions are the purposes, so why the student might be expressing something, and then the forms are the how, or kind of what it looks like and what way they express that. The content would be focusing on the positive, or what the student can do, so using tools that allow for students to express different communicative functions in a range of forms, so that that's okay. And then the last feature would be having a tool that is appropriately sensitive. So this again relates to that point I was making in the last slide, that if you do not have enough detail at the level where the student is performing, you won't be able to really get valuable information to inform instruction. It's just going to be the gaps between your measurement points are too great. So what we want to see is that list of skills, that this is what the student can do, and then that juncture of where they start to hit a challenge, and then the +1, because that's going to allow us to describe their present level, then describe where that challenge occurs, and then identify what our goal is going to be. And again, if we don't have enough points along that continuum to look at, then it's going to not provide that information for us. So we want to access a range of sources for the content. So talking to as many partners as possible is really important, particularly for those individuals with the complex communication needs. And typically what I'll do is just ask someone to talk to me about the way the student communicates, whether it be at school or at home, and I just ask them to, start talking. And I listen in particular for their interpretations. So the example here is, oh, she really loves the book Harry Potter. So this is mom's interpretation of something that the student has done, that she's now telling me she's reading it as that her daughter loves the book Harry Potter. So at that point, I would say, tell me about how you know that. How does she show you that? Because that's going to be important information for me to record. So if mom says, well, she smiles and she looks at me and she taps the pages and she reaches for the book when it's time to put it away, that helps me to know, okay, when this child shows that she enjoys something or she wants something, this is how she might express it. And so that goes back to that sort of different ways of expressing a function, that she may not use words to say, I like it, but she can use actions to express that same function. So I put a pink star by this because I have 3 of them, I think, on the slides that are inserted in places where I find these techniques are particularly effective in getting more robust and detailed information about communication. So I'm hoping that if you don't do this, that you might try that. And there's some supports in our activity at the end that might help with that. So the next feature of a strong assessment has to do with the context, or the sort of the environment of the assessment. And in general, we really want to stick with natural, familiar contexts because that's going to be where our students perform best. So you might start by looking at, say, your checklist or tool, just to remind yourself, like, what am I looking for? And that's important because if you don't think about the range of things that you might be looking for, what functions might I look for, or just look at those checklists and different assessment tools that are on the resource handout, and have that available. So you're going to be doing some informal observation, but you'll also be referencing this checklist or tool so that it guides your observation, right? You want to observe in sort of typical scenarios at first without intervening. So the next slide, you'll see what we do when we do intervene, but you can get a ton of information. Probably 90% of the information that I get when I go out and do a needs assessment is just by observing typical routines. And I don't do a thing. I just observe typical interactions. If the child is interacting with familiar partners, be cognizant of the partner's role. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. But the partner can have a strong influence on what the student does or does not do. And we have to be careful that we don't attribute that to the student positively or negatively. Be open to a wide range of forms for each function. So this is what I was talking about earlier, is that the way that this child or the student expresses a particular communicative function may look very different than what you expect. It's not necessarily going to be in words or in pictures, so you have to be keen to observe their actions and interpret those as communicative functions. So translating or explicating what you see. And again, we'll do some practice with that at the end so you see what that looks like. Engineering opportunities. So once you sort of look at the natural context and you observe with your guidance of your checklist and your tools, you want to go back and say, okay, what did I not see and why did I not see that? Sometimes it is a situation where there's lack of opportunity. So it's not necessarily a lack of a skill, it's lack of an opportunity to express a skill. And that can be because there was no naturally occurring opportunity or because the partner took the opportunity. So trying to think of an example. If you wanted to see, does this child reject something that they're given, and there was no opportunity for anyone to give them anything, well, I'm not sure if they would reject something that they were given. I have to maybe engineer that specifically to see what happens, right? So it just didn't happen to come up. On the other hand, the other day I was working with a student and the iPad kept pulling up some error messages. And I found that I was jumping in and closing out the error messages before I waited to see what the student did. So if I wanted to determine, does the student know to request assistance, I can't tell you whether they do or they don't because the partner intervened. I got in the way of letting him show me what he could do. So being aware of when, one, there was no real space or time for that to happen, or two, whether the partner intercepted an opportunity and didn't give the child a chance to do it themselves, and in which case you may have to set those items up or have the partner back off or something like that. But surprisingly, it's a lot of times the case that we don't say, when we say, okay, the student can't or doesn't do this, then the next question should be, where did I expect to see that? Where did they have a chance to show me that? And more often than you would think, there was no chance to do that. There was no chance to show that. You see that a lot with initiation. People are always, initiation's, a big goal that folks want to have. And funny enough, if you watch, lots of times there's no real opportunity for initiation. Kids are very directed, particularly in school, with what they need to do, and they don't get to make a lot of choices or act on their own will. So, and when they do, it's sometimes not recognized as that. So when they make a move or an action on their own, so that's one of those areas where working on initiation sounds good, but the reality is sometimes we inhibit that because we want to kind of keep kids on track. So we have to identify, is that truly a goal, and if so, provide some opportunities to work on that. Okay, let's take a look at the communication assessment materials and resources. And in fact, I'm just going to direct you to the handout of the assessment tools. These tools are going to focus primarily on the early communication assessment materials, and the reason is simply that those are harder for folks to find. It's easier when you get more conventional communicators and those that are intentional and symbolic, and you can use some of the standardized assessments that are adapted for those with those more advanced abilities. But when you get the emergent communicators, some folks can find it hard to find a test that would work for that student. So that's why this handout and this presentation is kind of focusing on that, because it's really an area of great need. So I would like to present a bit of a caution about the use of standardized tests, whether it's with an emergent communicator or someone with more advanced skills. And this is from the American Speech Language Hearing Association. It should be noted that test scores would be invalid for testing a client who is not reflected in the normative group for the test's standardized sample, even if the test were administered as instructed. However, these tests can provide valuable descriptive information about a client's abilities and limitations in the language of the test. So in my language, most standardized tests were not created for individuals with complex communication needs. So you cannot report a score on a test that wasn't created and normed or tested on that population. You can, though, use those tests if they're appropriate in terms of their content as one of your assessment tools, and you just have to report the results accordingly. And typically, it's more of an anecdotal report and not using testing measures or age equivalents or things like that. So just know that little caveat. And here we have a nice little quote from our own Erin Sheldon from her recent book with Stephen Calculator, where she kind of concurs with what we've been talking about. Observation-based, descriptive, and portfolio assessment strategies are forms of alternative assessment in naturalistic settings that capture more of the student's comprehension and knowledge. So this is what we're talking about, is natural environments, and it gives us the information that we really want, right? So what do they know? What do they understand? The same holds true for communication. Okay, so let's talk about what we do with the results of our communication assessments. The results, no matter how they come in, need to be interpreted. So whether it's a checklist or a sample or something, we need to interpret that to determine and share with others what's meaningful about this information. So just sort of having it in a list form may not be useful. So part of our, as a professional group, if you're an educator, a speech pathologist, you need to interpret that and determine what is meaningful. As a family member, you would want to ask, tell me about what this means, what we're looking at here. Always, 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 we can and should focus on the positive, what the child can do and what we're going to do next. There's always, always positive there, and we just have to choose to emphasize that and not to focus on the negative, which can be just really difficult to process and determine what to do with that information, and quite honestly isn't very useful. So you can get the same kind of emphasis on the positive and the same picture, right? So it's the same student no matter whether you focus on the positive or negative. So why not just focus on what the student can do, and again, that juncture of where they're challenged and then what they're going to be doing next. Also, you can include in your results what kind of changes in the environment or the goals or the services might be indicated as that. So if the student functions, you noticed, better under certain conditions, that's important results of the assessment that you could use. What might we do with those results of an assessment? Well, what we could do is use that to, just as I mentioned in the latter half of that last slide, provide more supportive context to the student for communicating. So we may determine that the student benefits from more wait time, or that the student benefits from more modeling, or whatever it is that we're doing. So we could build more of that into their program. We might increase opportunities to demonstrate an existing skill. So maybe we noticed once or twice a particular skill, or in one or two environments. So now we want to broaden the breadth of that and generalize it to new environments. So they have the skill, it's just not as strong as we would like. Maybe we want to kind of go in a vertical, kind of expanding something that they're doing in one form to a new form. So going from more of a concrete representation or an action-oriented representation to a symbolic representation, if that's appropriate. And then we may determine that what new skills we want to teach, and we do that by making sure there's an opportunity, again, that vacuum, that space for the child to demonstrate the skill, and then that we're doing modeling and or instruction or teaching them in that moment how to use that particular skill. So these are just some ideas about what do we do with the information that we get as a result of testing, and so it doesn't just live in a report somewhere. Okay, so some potential next steps towards success with our communication assessments. You might want to check out some of the new tests or options from the handouts. You could do some practice observations using videos, which is what we're going to do next. You could do actual student observations using the same structure that we're going to use in the video. You could either request information from the family, or if you're a family, you could supply information about these communicative functions and what you see in this child. You can practice rephrasing can't do to can do in your written assessments. And on your next assessment, really emphasize interpretation of information rather than just reporting kind of, what you observed. Kind of look at what would that be how useful is that type thing. So just some ideas about how you might want to use the information from this webinar. And another quote as we transition into our observation is observation-based assessment describes a more complete picture of the child's abilities in areas that should be targeted for instruction. So with that, we will transition into our video observation component of this webinar.